Okay, the purpose of this video is to help teach people how to do a piston soak to free stuck oil control rings in their Kia or Hyundai motor. I suppose this would work in some other ones as well, but I'm specifically working on Kias and Hyundais because they have such a hard time with burning oil. I'm going to try to make this short and sweet. I'm going to pause and restart the recording throughout the process to try to keep it on point. I'm going to briefly go over some of the stuff that you're going to need for the soak. One, you're going to need a longer ratchet with a 22mm socket for your crank bolt to manually crank the motor. You'll need 10mm sockets for removing your coil packs, and if you have splash shield on the bottom of your vehicle, you're either going to need a trim removal tool or 10mm sockets. It just depends on what your particular vehicle has. First, you're going to want to get a basic cheap oil, synthetic, get the right viscosity for your motor, and then you're going to want to get a bottle of the Valvoline Restore and Protect oil. And I'll explain how this all gets used throughout the process. You're going to want to get some sort of an emissions cleaner. It doesn't have to be the Lucas. There are different brands out there, but the purpose of this is to get into the system before we start the soak and help keep your catalytic converter and O2 sensors clean from any residual blow-by that goes through the system as we burn the soak and carbon materials off. You're going to want to get an intake valve and turbo cleaner. I have heard mixed results of this being used with turbo motors, so you use it as you choose. If you don't want to, that's fine. I do this just to keep the intake valves as clean as I can. I've done this every oil change. Just follow the instructions on it, go through the process and get that done. Once you've got that intake cleaner done, you're going to want to use the B12 chem tool. This is what the soak material is. And you're also going to want to have probably, I would say, a minimum of 4 cans, but truthfully, if you have a heavy oil burner, you might want to do up to 6 cans. It depends on how long you want to do the soak. I personally have done 6 or 7 cans on the worst oil burner, and I might have been a little overboard, but I wanted to hit it good. So you're also going to want to have something like this. This is kind of like a generic seafoam. You can get seafoam, you can get, Walmart has a SuperTech oil treatment fluid kind of like this. Gumma has something like this. I didn't want to go with something expensive. The Walmart treatment is, I think, $5 a can. This was at Menards for $5 a can. I've also got carbon throttle body cleaner. I'll explain how we use that throughout the video. You're also going to want to make sure that you have a new PCV valve for your car to put in after the soak. Having a little measuring cup here has the measurements on there, ounces. That way we know how much fluid we're putting in each cylinder, so we can divide our cans up evenly, or however much we need to put in for each cylinder. You want to have a funnel like this so you can stick down in there, the spark plug holes, to dump our fluid in so we don't spill it all over the place. You're going to want to do a compression test on the motor. I bought me a digital compression tester on Amazon. It wasn't too much money. I would get one that can go over 200 psi, because specifically the Kia 2.4 liter can top over 200 psi. I think mine hit about 208 psi. But we want to know what the compression is to tell what the cylinders with the piston rings are doing in there. Also, getting yourself a borescope. I have a standalone unit, but you can get one for pretty cheap. It just plugs into the bottom of your phone and you use an app to use it. I prefer to have one that has the downward facing camera, plus this has 2 side facing cameras. You can get one that has an articulating tip. It kind of does what my finger does to look around. So that's something to have. It's really important to have for this soak to do it properly. Last but not least, I created, it's basically a whisk. This is 1/4 inch PEX tubing, and this is 0.095 weed trimmer line. I just put it in my drill. This allows me to use that fluid there at a certain point in the soak to fill the cylinder up and whisk that around, and I suction it back out. So you will also need one of those oil change pumps, one that's designed to fit down the dipstick hole, has a really narrow tube. That way you know it can get down the spark plug hole. We're not using it for changing oil, but we are going to suction fluid back out of the cylinders with that. You're also going to want to have some sort of a longer rod. I just happen to have this longer punch, but you can have a longer piece of dowel. This is for making sure we know how far our cylinders, our pistons are down in the cylinder. When we start the soak process, we want our cylinders to basically be even with each other, but as far down as they can be. So you can go through each one, just kind of make a rough measurement of how far it down is. It doesn't have to be exact, but we want to have enough space in there for our fluid to build up and soak. I think that's it for the fluid part, so I'm going to pause the video and we'll be back here shortly. Okay, I'm going to assume you've got your fuel system cleaner in that is designed for the catalytic converter as well, the exhaust system. Now that we've got that run into the system, if you're choosing to do the intake valve cleaning, now is the time we're going to get this done. You're going to need a second person to help with this. Follow the instructions. On this particular vehicle, you just got to take your air cleaner, the intake off here, and remove this to get to the throttle body. But follow the instructions on this. Get that process done, and once you're done with that, it is time to come back home. Let your motor cool off a little bit. You don't want this to be really hot when you start the soak process, so let it cool off. Now, before you are getting ready to do the compression test, because that's the next step in this, we want to make sure the compression test is done and make sure that you write down what each cylinder was. If you have low pressure, you're going to notice that you have problems with the compression rings in there. I had one of the motors I worked on had 190 some psi for all of them, except for one was at 159. That one took a little bit of extra soaking to get those compression rings freed up, and it also required a follow-up soak to unstick the oil control rings at the bottom of the piston. So we're going to get ready for the compression test now. So you're going to go ahead, start your car, come over here to your fuse box here, and you want to find your fuel pump fuse. And as it's running, pull your fuel pump fuse out and let the vehicle run itself out of fuel from the fuel rail. Once it dies, you're good to go ahead and start removing your ignition coils. So pull your tab out, pull it out, get 10mm bolts on each one of these. Pull those out. On this vehicle, I kind of had to pop this up here a little bit to get to the bolt a little more easily, and also to get this back down, I had to kind of twist it. So get those out, get your spark plugs pulled out. Now is a good time if you have been burning a lot of oil or have a lot of miles to consider replacing your spark plugs. You're going to have them out. It's good to start fresh at this point, in my opinion, but I'll leave that up to you. But now, do your compression testing. What I found, about 10 or so seconds of cranking, got the pressures where they needed to be. Just make sure you write those down and verify it later on if it changed. You won't be able to do it until after the soak for a while, but go ahead and get that done and write them down. Now that you've got the compression testing done, it's a good time to take your bore scope and just look down each cylinder to see how much carbon is on top of each piston top. And if you have side-facing cameras, it's a good time to manually crank the motor to bring the intake valves all the way open. That way you can look inside the intake valves a little bit and see if they are really built up with carbon. I like to get as much carbon off these as I can because that carbon is just going to get down in the motor more. So the cleaner it is, the more effective this soak is going to be for you. Now that we have the cylinders checked to see what carbon is going on in there, we will go ahead and start the soak process. Mind you, make sure that you have your motor cooled off. This fluid will boil back up out of the cylinders. Found that out through experience. So once you have your pistons all kind of manually leveled with each other, they don't have to be dead perfect, but as level as you can get it. The B12 is 15 ounces, so I split that in 4, so you got 3.5 ounces going into each cylinder. I do a little heavier soak for the initial dose, but you're going to put that in there and let it sit. I might come back in 2 hours and check with my borescope and see if the fluid is still standing on the piston tops. If it's still standing on the piston tops, I let it soak a little bit longer. But in about 4 hours total from the starting of it, you want to come back and look again. I like to manually rotate the motor a few cranks to get those pistons moving. You don't want to crank it hard, go slowly. And when you're doing that, and I forgot to mention this, when you're doing the actual soak, I buy those cloth, I think they're Scott brand or Shop Towel brand. They're like a cloth blue napkin basically. I wad those up and stuff them in the spark plug holes to keep anything from falling down in there, and that also helps minimize evaporation of the fluid. But I keep those in while I'm cranking the motor because that fluid will spurt up out of there when it compresses, especially if you're not careful with cranking it slowly. But crank it a few times and let that fluid get worked into the rings a little bit. Assuming your fluid has all gone down, re-level your pistons again. You might want to just do 2 ounces per each cylinder this next time of the Berryman. If you have enough cans, you can hit it with a higher dosage as well. But we're going to keep repeating this process every 4 to 6 hours. We're going to let it soak, verify that the fluid is drained out with our borescope, and if it has drained out all the cylinders, it's time to rotate the motor again. And you can also rotate the motor slowly if you have a really low dose in it. Let's say you put 2 ounces in each cylinder to start with. You can slowly hand crank that motor and let the fluid get up and kind of, I guess, kiss the bottom of the cylinder head and the valve faces there. That helps start working on the carbon up there as well. But let's let it sit and then check it again every 4 to 6 hours, and we're going to keep repeating that process. I might start it on a Friday night since I have weekends off and keep doing this until midday Sunday. Obviously I let it sit overnight, and when I let it sit overnight I do a heavier dose to let it soak. But if you have any cylinders that just do not want to drain, it's typically because the carbon is so built up in there. You've got to keep hitting that. Which you'll be able to tell that if you have your borescope, you'll be able to tell if it is draining properly or not. But we're going to keep doing that, repeated until we are, I'd say 24 hours in, then we're going to switch to a different method. So I'm going to pause the video and we'll come back and start out with that. Okay, now we should be about 24 hours into the soak. I like to switch gears. I have kind of developed this process through trial and error over several soaks on different vehicles and found this to be very good at getting the carbon out. You don't really have to have any of the B12 in the motor at this point. If you want to put maybe an ounce or two in there, you can, but you don't have to. This here is 16 ounces for this particular can. You can get, for instance, the really big seafoam cans that are made for SUVs and trucks that are 20 ounces. But I prefer to take half of this and put it in each cylinder. So I'll have 2 cans to fill up all 4 cylinders. So again, you want to make sure your cylinders are down. Verify that with your whatever you're going to use to measure the distance of those. You just want them to be as low as they possibly can be, but all pretty much even. So also, one thing real quick before I fill that fluid in there, I take the carbon throttle body cleaner and spray a little bit down each cylinder. That helps soften up the carbon a little bit more on the piston tops. And then I go ahead and put this in there. Once I have that in there, this is where my whisk comes into play. And you only use this on low speed. You don't need it on high speed. I like to actually have 1 cylinder at a time doing this, just because I'm not letting fluid drain where I don't want it to drain. I want it to sit in the pistons a little bit. See if I can do this holding this. So this sheath here that I made for the PEX tubing and the trimmer line here, I'm pulling it out here. This allows you to get this down the spark plug hole. And once it's down, I'm going to put my phone down real quick and so I can show you what I'm going to do here. You're going to pull the line back in, which you're going to have to kind of work it in on this end here, but you want this to be back up this way. If there's too much showing here, this is going to bind up, so you want this as close as you can. But basically what this is doing is creating a whisk. So you're going to hold the tubing here, which I can't with 2 hands here, so but you're going to rotate this, and that is going to swish the fluid around there, basically whisking it. I will push this down in there and hold that, and I'll push it down to the pistons and really whip that fluid up. That helps loosen any carbon on the cylinder walls up top by the head, and it also loosens up a lot of the carbon on the piston tops. I will do that, and I will kind of work it up and down in there, making sure not to bring it out. You want the tubing, the PEX tubing, to be inside the spark plug threads. That's to help prevent the line from getting cut, but it also provides support for it. But I do that, and then once you're done whisking that, this is where the oil pump comes in handy. So find yourself a pump that has the narrow tube that can go down this dipstick hole. You can get the ones that are 12 volt to hook straight up your battery, but we're going to stick that tube. I tried a different one that had too big of a tube, but so find one that has a tube that'll fit down your spark plug hole. And as soon as we get done whisking that first cylinder, get yourself a container, and we're going to suction that fluid back out of the cylinder. You're going to have a lot of loose carbon that comes out with that fluid. And the reason why I started using this whisking method was I didn't want all that carbon to make its way down into the rings more through the soak. I want to get as much out as I can instead of it getting further into the motor. But we're going to do that for every cylinder. Once we're done with that, we can go ahead and look at our borescope and see what the combustion chamber is looking like, see what the bottom of the cylinder head looks like if you have a borescope that can see that. But we're really looking mostly at the piston tops to see how clean they're getting. Now that we've got that done, we will revisit with more B12 soak. Sometimes if I want to have a little bit longer soak, I guess a wetter soak you could say, that won't evaporate or drain as fast, I might put a little bit of my motor treatment stuff in there, whether it be Seafoam or the FVP stuff I have. Just a tiny bit of that in there will help that stay wet in there longer. But we're going to revisit that soak again every 4 to 6 hours. We're going to be checking fluid. We're going to be manually rotating the motor, keep those rings moving, get the fluid into them, and then after we're done with that, once we notice that the fluid has drained all the way through, you might have gone through a couple more cans of B12 at this point. We should be about 24 hours later into the process, so about 36 to 48 hours total into the soak process, I would say. We're going to go ahead and revisit filling the cylinders again with the little bit of the carburetor and throttle body spray first, and then more of that liquid we're using to do the whisking. So we'll do that again. Whisk every cylinder individually, suction it back out, and assuming that you had all of your fluid soak past the piston rings during the soak, you should have your rings freed up. It is possible you might have to revisit the soak, but if you have any standing fluid that just does not want to go past those rings, you're going to have to keep soaking a little bit longer. You will have a tiny bit of fluid sitting on top of the pistons a little bit, but it shouldn't be clear to the edge. It's just going to be wet on top of the pistons. What I like to do to clear that out, I will take some, I've got some microfiber towels, but something that has a little bit of density to it, and I will pack it over the holes, the valve cover holes here, and kind of have something heavy so that way it can't, because it'll spurt up out of here. So you want to make sure that you don't have this wide open, because you don't want that B12 and stuff getting on your paint. It can damage your paint. But we're going to go ahead and put our rags over there, go in, and we're going to crank the motor a few times. Make sure that you have as much fluid suctioned out as you can before you do this, but you want to crank that motor a few times to really shoot that fluid up out of the cylinders. After I've done that, I like to use my air compressor with a longer nozzle, and I stick it down in each hole, and I hold a rag over here as I blow it, and I force the air down into the piston, maybe 30 or 40 psi max. You don't need super strong pressure. You're just trying to kind of air dry the remaining fluid down in that cylinder as much as you can. Some of that will blow back up onto your rag and help capture it, and that's what you want it to do. So now that we've got this part of the soaking done, you should be ready to start reassembling stuff in the motor. Now is the time you're going to want to put your PCV valve back in. Mine happens to be right here. It's usually by the oil filler cap here. Once you get that put back in, we can go ahead and put your spark plugs back in. And like I said, if you have the ability to get new spark plugs, this is a good time to do it. Start out fresh with oil, or with spark plugs that haven't been oil fouled or anything. Get those back in, get our caps, our coils back in, all connected back here. Make sure you get that back down. And once you have your spark plugs in and everything's torqued down, you can come back over here and put your fuse back in your fuel pump area. Now that you've got that in there, you want to not start the motor yet. But if you don't have it up on ramps or jack stands yet, make sure you jack it up and get them on there. Like I said, if you have a SUV, you're probably going to want to do most of this work flat on the ground, but do not start your car yet. It's okay to crank the motor with that fuel pump fuse out, but you do not want to be running the motor with all that extra fluid in the crankcase. In fact, you might be better off if you just go ahead and drain everything out before you even crank it. I didn't, but I didn't have any problems. But just do not run your motor with that extra fluid in there. But get your oil changed out now. Start with your cheap oil. The reason why I do a cheap oil first is my vehicle, when I did it, I wanted to get the extra cleaner kind of flushed out of the system, because there is going to be some residual cleaner left in your oil. I wanted to get as much of that out, plus any additional cleaning that was going to happen inside the motor. That oil would help get it out of there. And after 50 to 100 miles, I changed my oil back out, and it was very, very dark black. So it did a lot of cleaning. So change your oil with a cheap oil first. Now that you've got the oil changed, now we can go ahead and start your motor. And one thing before I forget, if you're doing the cheap oil first, there's no need to change your oil filter just yet. If you're doing a very short interval, 50 to 100 miles, I use the existing filter on my vehicle instead of wasting one. But you can choose to do as you wish. But now that we got the oil changed, it is time to start the motor. It might be a little hard to get it cranked over at first, so just keep working at it. Eventually it should fire up, and it might start and stumble a few times, but eventually it should go. Make sure you're doing this outside. Don't do it in a garage. Even if the door is open, do it outside, and in fact, keep your garage door closed. It is going to likely smoke like crazy. Every vehicle I've done has smoked a lot, so I let mine idle here for about 15 minutes until it finally stopped smoking, and then I went for a drive. The drive helped burn the excess fluid off, and remember, having the emission system cleaner in the vehicle will help. Doesn't guarantee anything, but it does help keep your O2 sensors and catalytic converter a little bit cleaner from the stuff we're going to be burning through the exhaust. So go for your drive, get that burnt off. You can come back, let your vehicle sit, let it cool off. You're effectively done with a soak at this point. And the next day or two, try to get yourself a 50 to 100 mile drive in with that cheap oil in. Once you have that done, now you're going to go ahead and change the oil out again, put the Valvoline Restore and Protect oil in. That oil is designed to clean carbon out of your piston rings. I've seen independent testing that shows that it really works. It doesn't clean it rapidly, but if we did a good job on the soak, we should be able to get the oil to work overtime with this now. Really just kick it into overdrive and continue that cleaning. Some people can be a little bit worried about that clogging oil filters. If you're that concerned, change your filter in 1,000 miles. That's a cheap insurance. But it sounds like they said they designed this oil to not clean at too rapid of a pace. But get that done. You're probably gonna have a lot of cleanup in here as well from fluid, just so you know. So keep rags and stuff on hand to keep that cleaned up. But your soak should effectively be done now. Drive it. Make sure that you're monitoring your oil burning. I would be checking it about every 250 miles. I did have one vehicle that it kind of clogged things up, and that started burning oil even worse temporarily. It had burned a quart in 250 miles, so I had to re-soak that motor. So you may have to revisit your soaks. So don't be afraid to drive it 500 miles or so, see where your oil burn rate is. If it's not bad, fine. If you get through your normal service interval with the oil, I'm doing 3,750 roughly miles, just because I do more of a severe service driving with the way I drive in my town. Plus, it's going to be harder for carbon to form from that oil doing the short intervals. So just monitor it throughout your service interval. If you are still burning some, but you're burning far less than what you were, don't be afraid to hit it with another soak. I've done it on 2 different vehicles that needed it, and both of those now burn 0 oil. I can't really think of anything else I need to bring up. I would just say, if you want to recheck your compression, check it in a week or 2. Let those rings get set back in there and then recheck your compression, especially if you had some that were low. But it's possible that you could have created an issue where something got clogged up a little more, but that compression test will tell you what's going on for the most part with that cylinder, and you know you need to soak it more. I can't really think of anything else, so I'm going to leave the video here. But if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me. I will try to help you as much as I can. Like I said, I've done this process on 5 vehicles now and stopped the oil burning on them. It's not anywhere near as expensive as taking it to a dealer, and it's not that hard to do. If you are a little bit mechanically inclined, this is a very simple process. Just the most important thing to remember is you do not want to run this motor with all that cleaner in there. So make sure that you do not crank it until you've got the oil changed and refilled with your good oil. Anyway, good luck. I hope it helps you. Thank you.